The millionaire CEO hung up on her, convinced the child wasn't his. But 5 years later, he saw the twins, and his own eyes staring back at him. Title: 5 Winters Later. Chapter 1. Once, Jonathan Hale believed his world was built on logic and control. Young, confident, with piercing blue eyes and a commanding presence, he was the CEO of a company he had built from the ground up. Money, power, influence, everything was within his grasp. Then Hannah came into his life, a woman so genuine and full of light that she unsettled everything he thought he knew about himself. She saw the man behind the title, and that terrified him. When she told him she was pregnant, Jonathan panicked. His fear drowned out love. "You think I'll believe he's mine?" he said coldly before hanging up the phone, cutting her out of his life as if it were just another business decision. Chapter 2. Hannah cried, but not for long. She didn't have the luxury of breaking down. The pregnancy was difficult, the doctors spoke of risks, but when she heard 2 tiny heartbeats during the ultrasound, she knew she had a reason to fight. She left the city, her friends, and everything that reminded her of him. In a small coastal town, she started a new life. Months later, she gave birth to 2 boys, Noah and Liam, identical as mirrors, both with the same blue eyes that haunted her dreams. Sometimes at night, when she watched them sleep, she saw flashes of Jonathan's face, and it hurt. But she promised herself that her sons would never grow up knowing pain or rejection, even if that meant he would never know them. Chapter 3. 5 years passed. Jonathan had everything he'd ever wanted: success, recognition, and power, but the more he gained, the emptier he felt. His smiles at business meetings had become mechanical, applause from investors rang hollow. He lived in a penthouse overlooking the city, yet every morning he woke up with a strange sense of loss he couldn't explain. Late at night, he'd find himself staring out at the skyline, remembering her voice, that trembling call, and the words he had thrown at her like knives. Sometimes he'd whisper to himself, "If I could just take it back." But he couldn't undo the past, or so he thought. Chapter 4. That winter evening, after closing one of the most profitable deals of his career, Jonathan stepped out of a luxury restaurant. Snow was falling softly under the glow of the streetlights. Then he heard laughter, children's laughter, pure and bright, and something in him froze. Near the fountain stood a woman in a white coat, and beside her, 2 boys were building a snowman. They had curly brown hair and bright blue eyes, his eyes. His heart stopped. He didn't need confirmation, he knew. And when the woman turned, her eyelashes brushed with snow, he saw the face he had tried and failed to forget. Hannah. Chapter 5. She saw him too. For a few seconds, neither of them moved, as if the world itself had paused. Then she took the boy's hands, ready to walk away, but his voice stopped her. "Hannah," he said, his voice cracking. She turned slowly, her expression calm but guarded. "It's been 5 years, Jonathan," she said quietly. "It's too late." He took a hesitant step closer, eyes locked on the children. "Are they?" She didn't answer, but her silence said everything. The pain in his chest was almost physical, a punishment for every choice he'd made. Chapter 6. The next day, Jonathan found himself standing on the porch of a small house by the coast. He didn't know what he was hoping for: forgiveness, understanding, maybe just a chance to be near them. When Hannah opened the door, surprise flickered in her eyes, replaced quickly by caution. He only asked for a few minutes. The conversation was heavy, filled with long pauses and unsaid words. "You chose fear back then," she said softly. "And I chose life." Jonathan had no defense. For the first time in years, he truly listened, not as a businessman, but as a man who had lost something priceless. Watching Noah and Liam playing quietly in the corner, he realized he didn't just want to be around them, he needed to. Chapter 7. He started visiting more often. At first, it was awkward. He'd stand by the door, unsure what to say. But over time, it became natural. He helped with repairs, brought groceries, took the boys to the park. They started calling him Uncle John. He'd watch them laugh, run, argue, and every time they looked at him with those blue eyes, something inside him healed. One afternoon, Noah asked innocently, "Are you our dad?" Jonathan didn't answer, he just pulled him close, holding him tightly. It was the first time he understood that family wasn't about blood or names, it was about love, about showing up, about never leaving again. Chapter 8. 1 year later, snow fell again over the city. They were standing outside the same restaurant where everything had started. But now, the scene was different. The boys held Jonathan's hands, Hannah stood beside him, her smile soft and knowing. "I didn't think you could love again," she said quietly. "Neither did I," he replied, his eyes shining. "Until I saw you." The streetlights reflected in her eyes as snowflakes landed on their hair. Jonathan leaned in and kissed her gently, whispering, "Now I finally understand what really matters." And for the first time, he didn't feel like a man who had everything, he felt like a man who had finally found home. It wasn't a story about loss, it was about redemption. About a man who thought love was a weakness, until he realized it was the only thing that could save him. Hannah Carter had never imagined that one phone call could destroy everything she thought she knew about love. When Jonathan's cold voice echoed through the receiver, every hope she had built around them crumbled in an instant. His words, sharp and deliberate, sliced through her like glass, leaving her breathless and hollow. The man who once held her with such tenderness, who whispered dreams into her hair, had suddenly become a stranger. She stood there for a long time after the line went dead, the quiet hum of the city outside her window blurring into nothingness. The pregnancy test was still on the counter, its small blue line staring back at her like a cruel reminder that her world had changed. The first tears came quietly, then uncontrollably, as she sank to the floor, clutching her stomach. She wasn't crying only for herself, she was crying for the child who would never know the father she had once believed was strong enough to protect them both. Days became weeks, and Hannah found herself moving through her apartment as if underwater. Her friends tried to reach her, but she couldn't bring herself to speak about it. How could she explain that the man who had promised her honesty had chosen pride instead? She quit her job at the company shortly after, unable to bear the sight of the office where she and Jonathan had once shared stolen glances and whispered secrets. She packed her things quietly, avoiding questions, avoiding pity. There was no place for her in that world anymore. With every passing day, her belly grew, and so did the weight of her new reality. There were moments of fear so overwhelming she could barely breathe, nights when she lay awake, her hands resting over the small swell of life inside her, whispering apologies she didn't know if anyone could hear. But even in her pain, something began to shift. It was subtle at first, like the way morning light crept through the blinds after a long night. Somewhere deep inside, a fierce, unfamiliar strength began to bloom. The pregnancy wasn't easy. The doctor visits were lonely, the medical bills daunting, but Hannah learned to survive. She moved to a smaller apartment, sold what she didn't need, and took freelance work from home to pay the rent. When she found out she was having twins, she laughed and cried at the same time. It felt like life was mocking her and blessing her all at once. She remembered sitting in the dimly lit examination room, clutching the ultrasound photo with trembling hands. Two tiny hearts. Two souls who hadn't asked for any of this but would soon become her entire reason to keep breathing. She whispered to them that day, promising she would give them the love of two parents, even if one of them would never know. When the contractions started one snowy night in December, Hannah was alone. The city outside was blanketed in white, the streets quiet except for the distant sound of traffic. She made it to the hospital in a blur of pain and panic, but when she held the two tiny, crying babies in her arms, both with the same shade of blue eyes she had once fallen in love with, something inside her healed and broke all over again. She named them Noah and Liam, names that carried softness and strength, names that felt like home. Looking at them, she felt the magnitude of her choice. She had lost everything she thought she needed, but in her arms, she held everything that truly mattered. The first months were a blur of sleepless nights and quiet miracles. She learned to live on coffee and willpower, to hold one baby while feeding the other, to laugh at exhaustion because crying felt like surrender. There were moments when fear clawed at her, when she wondered if she could do it alone, but every time Noah reached for her finger or Liam smiled in his sleep, her doubts faded. Slowly, the ache in her heart dulled, replaced by a fierce, unshakable determination. She no longer thought about Jonathan every day, though his shadow lingered in small ways. It was in Noah's expression when he furrowed his brow, in the exact tilt of Liam's head when he smiled. She didn't hate him anymore. Hate required energy she couldn't afford to waste. She only pitied the man who had walked away from something so pure. By the time the twins turned 1, Hannah had started to rebuild her life. She moved to a small coastal town, far from the noise and memories of the city. The air smelled of salt and rain, and the sound of the waves became her new lullaby. She found work at a local art studio, painting murals and teaching children's classes on weekends. The people there didn't ask about her past, they only saw a kind woman with 2 bright, laughing boys. For the first time in years, she felt something close to peace. On quiet evenings, she would walk along the beach with Noah and Liam, their small hands in hers, their giggles blending with the sound of the sea. Sometimes she caught herself staring at the horizon, imagining a different life, one where Jonathan had made a different choice. But then one of the boys would tug her sleeve and call, "Mommy," and she would smile, letting the memory drift away like a wave receding into the ocean. She didn't know it then, but fate had a strange sense of timing, and the life she thought she had left behind was already finding its way back to her. 5 years had passed since Jonathan Hale had last heard Hannah's voice, but there were nights when it still echoed in his mind as if it had happened yesterday. He could remember every word of that phone call, every syllable dripping with disbelief and anger, but now, instead of pride, he only felt regret. He had built an empire in those years, expanded his company across continents, graced magazine covers, and stood at the top of every list that defined success. People called him a visionary, a genius, a self-made powerhouse. Yet, when the nights were long and the city outside his window glimmered with 1,000 lights, he felt like the loneliest man alive. His penthouse was filled with expensive silence, the kind that mocked him rather than comforted him. The sound of champagne glasses and hollow laughter at corporate parties no longer thrilled him. Every face around him blurred into the same expression, people wanting something from him, admiring him for what he could give, never for who he was. He often told himself that Hannah had been a mistake, a distraction, a chapter that ended exactly as it should have. But lies, no matter how often repeated, could never quiet the truth. He remembered her laugh, the warmth of her eyes, the way she could make him forget the world for a few hours. Those memories, once a source of irritation, had become the only things that still made him feel human. Jonathan had everything he had once thought he wanted, and yet he woke up every morning feeling like something essential was missing. He had spent his life mastering control, but control couldn't fill the void that stretched wider with every passing day. One evening, after another long day of negotiations and paperwork, Jonathan sat alone in his office. The building was quiet except for the faint hum of the city below. He stared at his reflection in the glass wall, same sharp suit, same confident posture, same empty eyes. For the first time, he truly saw what he had become. A man who traded love for ambition. A man who didn't know how to go back even if he wanted to. He leaned back in his chair, exhaustion creeping through him, and whispered under his breath, "You think I'll believe he's mine?" The words tasted bitter now, like poison he had swallowed years ago that still lingered inside him. He wondered where she was, if she had moved on, if she hated him, or if she had forgotten him completely. He told himself it didn't matter, but deep down, it mattered more than anything. Sometimes he thought about calling her, about finding out what had happened after that night, but pride always stopped him. Jonathan had spent his whole life building walls around himself. Tearing one down now felt like weakness. Instead, he worked harder, chasing every deal, every success, as if accomplishment could fill the cracks in his heart. Yet, no matter how high he climbed, the emptiness only grew. The faces around him changed, the offices got bigger, but the silence followed him everywhere. It was around this time that people began to notice something different about him. His assistant would find him staring out of the window more often, his usual sharpness dulled by something unspoken. His colleagues whispered that maybe he was tired, maybe he needed a break, but none of them knew that the one thing Jonathan couldn't escape wasn't work, it was memory. He started dreaming about her again, about that night when she told him about the baby. In his dreams, he didn't walk away. He stayed, and her eyes softened, and the world didn't feel so cold. But when he woke up, reality hit him like a punch, and he went back to being the man the world expected him to be. One winter evening, after signing a massive international deal, his colleagues insisted on celebrating. The restaurant they chose was one of the most exclusive in the city, a place where every guest list read like a who's who of power and money. Jonathan agreed out of habit, not enthusiasm. He smiled through the evening, raised his glass, said all the right things, and played the part flawlessly. Yet as he stepped outside into the crisp night air, he felt nothing but fatigue. The snow was falling gently, covering the streets in a quiet white blanket. He loosened his tie, letting out a long breath, unaware that fate was already setting something in motion that would shake the foundations of his carefully constructed world. Across town, in a small coastal neighborhood, Hannah was finishing a painting for a local gallery. Her two boys, Noah and Liam, were asleep in their shared room, their small faces peaceful under the soft glow of a nightlight. She moved quietly, afraid to wake them, her brush gliding across the canvas. The house smelled of paint and vanilla candles, the kind of warmth that made strangers feel at home. Life wasn't easy, but it was hers. She had learned to be both mother and father, comforter and protector, dreamer and realist. And though the ache of Jonathan's absence still lingered like a scar, it no longer defined her. She had built a new life, one made of love, simplicity, and small miracles. Neither of them knew it, but the distance between them was already shrinking. 5 years of silence were about to collapse into a single, life-altering moment. The man who believed he didn't need love was about to come face to face with the two reasons why he had been wrong all along. Jonathan had been traveling for weeks, closing deals in Europe, shaking hands with billionaires, and giving interviews about his visionary leadership. Every headline called him unstoppable, but lately, even his own success felt like a cage. His life was perfectly orchestrated, meetings, dinners, flights, contracts, but all of it felt sterile, mechanical, lifeless. He was a man moving at the speed of light, but going nowhere inside. When he finally returned to New York, his assistant reminded him of a charity event hosted at one of his company's hotels, something he had promised to attend. He didn't care for social events anymore, but habit and image forced him to go. The lobby was full of people dressed in luxury, laughter echoing off the marble floors, champagne glasses clinking like small bells. He smiled, shook hands, exchanged empty pleasantries, and pretended to be present. But when he excused himself and stepped away from the noise toward the elevators, fate caught him off guard in the cruelest, most beautiful way possible. The elevator doors opened, and he stepped out into a quiet hallway leading to one of the hotel's private lounges. He was about to call his driver when he heard the faint sound of a child's laughter followed by a small voice. He turned instinctively, his gaze drawn toward a young boy running clumsily across the polished floor, chasing something invisible. The child couldn't have been more than 5. He had soft brown curls and piercing blue eyes, the exact shade Jonathan saw every morning in his own mirror. For a moment, the world stopped. It felt like gravity had shifted, pulling him into a silence so deep it hurt. His chest tightened, his breath caught, and every carefully constructed wall he had built around his heart cracked open. Before he could even process what he was seeing, a second boy appeared, identical to the first, holding a small toy car and calling his brother's name. The two of them laughed, their voices echoing softly through the corridor. Jonathan couldn't move. His brain screamed at him that it wasn't possible, that he was imagining things, that it couldn't be what it looked like. But deep down, instinct told him otherwise. The resemblance was undeniable. The same hair, the same eyes, the same tilt of the head when they smiled, it was like looking at two smaller versions of himself. His pulse pounded in his ears. He wanted to step closer, to ask who they were, but before he could take a breath, he heard a voice that made his world stop again. "Hurry up, boys," a woman called softly. And when she stepped into view, Jonathan forgot how to breathe. Hannah. She was standing there, her golden hair pulled back, her blue eyes tired but still beautiful in a way that tore something inside him. She looked older, stronger, softer all at once. She wasn't the woman he had left behind, she was someone who had survived without him. She wore a simple dress, her posture poised, her hands full with the two boys tugging at her. For a moment, she didn't see him. She bent down to tie one of the boys' shoes, her voice gentle, patient, the kind of warmth he hadn't felt in years. Then she looked up. Their eyes met, and time folded in on itself. Neither of them moved. The noise of the hotel faded until there was nothing but the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his chest. Her expression shifted in an instant, from surprise to disbelief to something guarded. She straightened slowly, her lips parting as if to speak but no words coming out. Jonathan's throat felt dry. The 5 years of silence, the anger, the guilt, the questions, everything came rushing back like a flood. He took one hesitant step forward, but she quickly reached for the boy's hands, her instinct to protect them immediate. "Hannah," he said finally, his voice low, rough, almost pleading. She hesitated for only a second before shaking her head slightly, as if to remind herself this was real, not some cruel dream. "Jonathan," she said quietly, her tone calm but laced with something unspoken. Her gaze flicked to the twins, who were now watching the exchange curiously. He could see the confusion in her eyes, the fear, the anger she had buried for years. He wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but none of them could escape his lips. He could only stare, trying to make sense of the impossible. "They're yours," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The words hit him harder than any blow could have. His breath caught as he looked at the boys again, the truth settling in his bones with terrifying clarity. They were his sons. The sons he had never known, the lives he had walked away from before they had even begun. For a long moment, no one moved. The boys fidgeted, pulling at their mother's hands, unaware of the storm unfolding around them. Jonathan's mind raced through 1,000 thoughts, denial, shock, guilt, but underneath it all was something deeper, recognition. He had spent years pretending he didn't need love, pretending he had made the right choice, but standing there, looking at those children, he realized how much of his life had been built on lies. Hannah looked at him with eyes full of restrained pain, the kind that comes from being hurt and healing anyway. "You should go back to your party," she said softly, her voice trembling. "We don't belong in your world." But Jonathan couldn't move. The sight of them, the woman he had loved and the sons he had never known, rooted him to the floor. His carefully curated life, his empire, his money, all of it felt meaningless. The only thing that mattered now was standing in front of him, and for the first time in his life, he had no idea what to say. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. All he could manage was a whisper that sounded more like a confession than a question. "Are they happy?" Hannah looked at him for a long moment before nodding faintly. "Yes," she said. "They are." Then she turned and walked away, the two boys holding her hands, their small voices echoing down the hall. Jonathan stood there long after they were gone, his reflection in the glass now that of a man who had everything but suddenly realized he had nothing at all. Jonathan didn't sleep that night. He sat in the dim light of his penthouse, a glass of untouched whiskey in his hand, staring out at the city that used to make him feel powerful. Now, it only made him feel small. The image of Hannah and the twins wouldn't leave his mind, the way her voice trembled when she spoke, the identical faces of the boys, the color of their eyes that mirrored his own. Every time he blinked, he saw them again, the way one boy clung to her hand while the other peeked curiously at him, unaware of the storm raging between their parents. He had told himself for years that he had made the right choice, that she had been manipulative, that she had wanted to trap him with a child, but that illusion had shattered the second he looked into those children's faces. They were his sons. There was no denying it, no rationalizing it, no way to erase the truth. He had walked away from them before they even had a chance to exist, and the weight of that realization hit him like a tidal wave. For the first time in his life, Jonathan felt powerless. He had always been able to fix things, with money, with influence, with control, but this was different. You couldn't buy back time, you couldn't undo absence. All the years he had spent chasing success suddenly felt meaningless when he thought about the birthdays he had missed, the first words he hadn't heard, the moments he would never get back. He closed his eyes and remembered the way Hannah had looked at him, strong, cautious, but undeniably heartbroken. He had hurt her in a way that couldn't be undone, and somehow, she had survived without him. That realization alone filled him with a strange mixture of admiration and regret. In the morning, he went to his office earlier than usual, but he didn't open his laptop. He sat behind his desk, lost in thought, while his assistant knocked twice before entering. "Are you all right, Mr. Hale?" she asked cautiously. Jonathan forced a nod, muttering something about being tired, but even as he spoke, his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't focus on the reports or the contracts piling up in front of him. The numbers blurred on the screen. For once, business didn't matter. He needed to see them again, to see her again, not out of curiosity, but because he couldn't let it end like that. He had spent 5 years pretending to be untouchable, but all it took was one look at those boys to break the illusion completely. He spent the next few days trying to find out where she lived. It wasn't easy. Hannah had disappeared from the city after their breakup. But Jonathan was a man who always found what he sought. When he finally tracked her down to a small neighborhood outside the city, he didn't tell anyone. He got into his car one afternoon and drove there himself, unsure of what he would say or how she would react. The closer he got, the faster his heart pounded. He parked across the street from a small, cozy-looking house with white shutters and a small garden. Through the fence, he could see 2 small figures playing with a ball on the grass. Their laughter carried through the air, light and pure, and for a moment, Jonathan couldn't breathe. One of them fell, and the other rushed to help him up, their voices filled with joy and innocence. It was such a simple, beautiful moment, and he realized it was something he had never experienced with them. He watched silently, his chest tightening with a mix of love and guilt. Then he saw her. Hannah stepped out onto the porch, her hair glinting in the sunlight, her face calm but alert. She called the boys to come inside for lunch, and as they ran toward her, Jonathan's throat tightened again. She looked happy. Not extravagant or carefree, but content. There was a serenity about her that he hadn't seen before. He wanted to go to her, to say something, but his courage faltered. What right did he have to appear now, after all these years? He sat there for a long time, watching from the car, until one of the boys suddenly noticed him. Their eyes met through the fence. The child tilted his head curiously and waved. The simple, innocent gesture nearly broke Jonathan in half. He raised his hand weakly in return, but before he could do anything more, Hannah called the boy inside again. She hadn't seen him, or maybe she had and chose to pretend she didn't. That night, Jonathan couldn't stop thinking about it. He had never felt fear like this before, not in business, not in life. Fear of rejection, fear of the truth, fear of what he had become. He knew he couldn't stay away forever, but he also knew that walking back into their lives wouldn't be simple. He had destroyed something sacred, and there were no guarantees that he could fix it. Still, he couldn't let it end this way. He owed them more than silence, more than regret. The next day, he wrote a letter. He didn't plan it, the words just came. He wrote about how wrong he had been, how blind, how terrified of losing control. He wrote about the years he had spent trying to convince himself he didn't care, and how one look at those children had proven how deeply he did. He didn't ask for forgiveness, he knew he didn't deserve it, but he wanted her to know the truth, at least once. When he was done, he folded the letter carefully, placed it in an envelope, and drove back to her neighborhood. He left it in the mailbox without ringing the bell, standing there for a moment before walking back to his car. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt like he had taken a step toward the man he should have been all along. As he drove away, he glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The twins were playing on the porch again, their laughter echoing faintly behind him. He whispered their names softly, names he had only heard in passing, Noah and Liam, and a quiet promise formed in his chest. He would make things right, no matter how long it took, no matter how much it hurt. Because for the first time in his life, Jonathan Hale knew what it truly meant to lose everything, and what it would take to earn it back. The morning after leaving the letter, Jonathan couldn't focus on anything else. Every meeting, every phone call, every task felt like static noise compared to the single question echoing in his head: had she read it? He checked his phone constantly, even though he hadn't left his number. He told himself he wasn't waiting for a reply, but the truth was, he was desperate for one. He had spent his entire life making decisions and watching results unfold exactly as planned, but this time, he had no control over what would happen next. For the first time in years, the fate of something that mattered deeply to him was completely out of his hands. That day in the office, he found himself staring blankly at spreadsheets while his assistant repeated his name for the third time. When she finally got his attention, he realized he had been holding a pen without writing a single word for almost 20 minutes. He muttered an apology, claiming exhaustion, and left early. That evening, Jonathan drove aimlessly through the city. The lights blurred past him as his thoughts spiraled. He didn't even realize where he was heading until he found himself once again near Hannah's neighborhood. It was already dark, but some part of him couldn't stay away. He parked across the street, his headlights off, and looked toward the little house. There was light spilling through the curtains, a soft golden glow that looked like home. He could see silhouettes moving inside, one small and two even smaller. The sound of laughter reached him faintly through the winter air. The boys were awake, probably playing before bedtime. He imagined them in pajamas, Hannah reading them a story, and his chest tightened painfully. He had missed everything: first words, first steps, first nights of fever and fear, and now he was standing outside like a stranger peering into a life that should have been his too. He was about to drive away when the front door opened. Hannah stepped outside, her hair tied loosely, her sweater oversized, her expression unreadable. She had something in her hand, a small envelope. His heart skipped a beat. The letter. She looked at it for a long moment, as if debating what to do with it, then glanced up at the quiet street. Even from the car, Jonathan could see the hesitation in her eyes, the conflict of emotions, hurt, anger, disbelief, but also something softer, something like sorrow. She stood there for a while before finally turning and going back inside. He sat there long after she disappeared, feeling the weight of years pressing down on him. The next few days were unbearable. He tried to distract himself with work, but the world he had once controlled with ease now felt suffocating. Every boardroom, every handshake, every success seemed hollow. His colleagues noticed the change, though no one dared to mention it. Jonathan Hale was known for being unshakable, a man whose composure was legendary. But now his silence felt different, heavier. When he did speak, his tone lacked the fire that once commanded entire rooms. It wasn't until the end of the week that something shifted. He received an email from an unknown address. There was no subject line, only a single message: "We need to talk." He knew immediately it was from her. His pulse quickened as he stared at the words, reading them over and over as if they might vanish. She hadn't signed her name, but he didn't need to see it. He could almost hear her voice in the short, restrained tone. The email contained an address, an old coffee shop downtown they used to go to when things were still simple, before everything had fallen apart. He didn't reply. He simply grabbed his coat and left the office, ignoring his assistant's calls as he stepped into the cold evening. When he arrived, the coffee shop was half empty, the soft hum of quiet conversations filling the air. Hannah was already there, sitting near the window. She looked up when he entered, her gaze steady but distant. He approached cautiously, unsure whether to smile or apologize first. She gestured for him to sit, her posture calm but guarded. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. He wanted to reach across the table, to say everything he'd rehearsed in his head, but the words caught in his throat. Finally, she broke the silence. "I wasn't going to read it," she said quietly, her fingers wrapped around a cup of coffee. "But I did." Jonathan exhaled, relief and fear mixing inside him. "And?" he asked, his voice barely audible. She looked out the window for a moment before turning back to him. "You said you were sorry," she said slowly. "But Jonathan, sorry doesn't change the years we lost. It doesn't change the nights I spent alone with two newborns who cried for hours while I tried to remember how to breathe." Her voice trembled, but she didn't cry. She had learned how to be strong long ago. "You broke me," she continued, "but I had to rebuild myself because I didn't have a choice. And now you show up and tell me you've realized everything? What am I supposed to do with that?" He didn't try to defend himself. There was nothing he could say that would erase what he'd done. He lowered his gaze, his hands trembling slightly. "You don't have to forgive me," he said quietly. "I just needed you to know that I see it now. All of it. What I lost. What I threw away." He paused, his throat tightening. "I'm not asking for a second chance. I want to know them. Even if it's from a distance." Hannah's eyes softened slightly, but she didn't answer right away. She looked at him as if studying the man she once knew and the man sitting before her, trying to decide if they were the same or entirely different. Finally, she spoke. They don't know about you, she said. They know their father isn't here, but they don't know why. Jonathan nodded, feeling a sting behind his eyes. Then maybe it's time they do, he whispered. She hesitated again, then sighed. I don't know, Jonathan. I can't just let you walk in and confuse them. He leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I understand. But I'll wait. However long it takes. When they left the coffee shop, the air outside was sharp and cold. They stood for a moment on the sidewalk, the silence between them heavy but different now, less like a wall, more like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Hannah gave a small nod before walking away, and Jonathan watched her go, the faint hope that had been extinguished for years flickering to life again. That night, for the first time in half a decade, he slept without the ache of emptiness clawing at his chest. He didn't know what would come next, but he knew he wasn't done fighting for it. The next few weeks were a test of patience Jonathan had never experienced before. He had spent years mastering the art of control, commanding people and situations with confidence that bordered on arrogance, but now, every ounce of that confidence was gone. Each day felt like walking a tightrope suspended between hope and regret. After the meeting with Hannah, something inside him had shifted. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about the next deal or the next business move, he was thinking about the small faces that looked like him, the ones who didn't know he existed. He wondered what they liked, what made them laugh, what frightened them at night. The thought of how much he'd missed gnawed at him relentlessly. Every time he saw a father holding his child, he felt the ache of absence settle deeper in his chest. One morning, when the fog outside his apartment hadn't yet lifted, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Hannah. It was short, almost hesitant. If you want to meet them, you can. Saturday. 10 a.m. at the park near our house. He read it 3 times, his pulse quickening with disbelief. He typed a response and erased it twice before finally settling on a simple, I'll be there. The next 2 days were torture. He couldn't think, couldn't focus, couldn't even eat properly. His mind was consumed with the question of what he would say when he saw them. Would they like him? Would they even want to talk to him? He felt more nervous than he had before any negotiation or press appearance in his life. When Saturday came, the sky was pale and cloudless, the air sharp but bright. Jonathan arrived early, sitting in his car across from the park, watching families drift in and out. His heart raced every time he saw a child with dark curls or blue eyes, thinking for a moment it might be them. When Hannah finally appeared, he froze. She looked casual yet graceful, wearing a simple coat and jeans, her hair loose around her shoulders. And beside her were 2 identical boys, bundled in small winter jackets, their laughter cutting through the morning air. They ran ahead of her toward the playground, their voices light and full of life. Jonathan stepped out of the car slowly, as if afraid that one wrong movement would shatter the moment. He walked toward them, his hands trembling slightly. Hannah turned as he approached. For a moment, their eyes met, and though her expression was calm, he could see the storm of emotion behind it. You came, she said quietly. I said I would, he replied. The boys noticed him then. One of them stopped running and stared curiously, tilting his head in a way that made Jonathan's heart twist. The other boy ran back to Hannah, tugging at her coat and whispering something. She knelt down, said something softly, then gestured for them to come closer. Jonathan crouched down so he was at their level. Hi, he said gently, his voice almost breaking. I'm Jonathan. The twins exchanged glances, shy but curious. I'm Noah, one of them said, his voice small. And I'm Liam, added the other. Jonathan smiled, though his eyes burned. Those are good names, he said softly. I like them a lot. There was a pause, a stillness that seemed to stretch endlessly, and then Liam asked innocently, "Are you Mommy's friend?" Jonathan looked up at Hannah, who met his gaze silently, her jaw tightening. He looked back at the boys and nodded. "Yes," he said after a moment. "A long time ago, I was." They didn't seem to sense the weight behind his words. They smiled politely and ran back to the swings, calling for him to push them. Hannah hesitated, watching him. He took a breath and followed. As he pushed the swings, listening to their laughter, something inside him cracked open completely. Each sound, each smile, felt like a piece of him that had been missing was finally being returned. He felt tears sting his eyes, but he blinked them away quickly, not wanting to scare them. Hannah stood nearby, arms crossed, her expression unreadable, but every so often, he caught her looking at him, her eyes softening for just a moment before she looked away again. When they finally sat down on the bench together, the boys playing a few feet away in the sand, the silence between them was heavy but not hostile. Jonathan stared ahead, his voice quiet when he spoke. "I don't know what you told them," he said. "I don't know what story they grew up hearing about me. But whatever it was, I'll respect it." Hannah didn't answer at first. She looked down, fidgeting with the zipper of her coat. "I told them their dad wasn't ready," she said finally. "That he loved them, but he didn't know how to be there." Jonathan swallowed hard, his throat tight. "That's more mercy than I deserved," he said quietly. She turned to look at him then, her expression soft but tired. "They're good boys," she said. "They're happy. I didn't want them to grow up with bitterness." He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Thank you," he finally managed. The boys came running up then, shouting about a game they wanted to show him. He smiled through the lump in his throat and followed them again. For the first time in years, laughter came easily to him. It wasn't forced or polite, it was real, raw, and full of something he hadn't felt in years: belonging. When the sun began to set and the cold started to creep in, Hannah called the boys over. They hugged her legs, tired but happy, their cheeks red from the cold. Before they left, Noah turned back and waved. "Bye, Jonathan," he called out. "Will you come again?" Jonathan froze, his heart aching. He glanced at Hannah, who hesitated for only a second before giving a small nod. "If it's okay with your mom," he said softly. The boy grinned and ran off, hand in hand with his brother. Jonathan watched them go until they disappeared down the path. The park was quiet again, but he could still hear their laughter echoing faintly in his mind. As he walked back to his car, his chest felt both heavy and alive. He had made 1,000 deals in his life, but this fragile, uncertain connection, was the only one that truly mattered. And for the first time, he knew he would never stop fighting for it. The days after that meeting at the park became a blur of emotion and reflection for Jonathan. Something inside him had shifted permanently. It wasn't just guilt anymore, it was love, fierce and consuming, for two little boys he barely knew but who already meant more to him than his entire empire. He started showing up at the park every weekend, careful not to overstep, always waiting for Hannah to give the smallest nod before approaching them. At first, it was awkward. The boys treated him like a friendly stranger, someone who pushed them on swings or helped them build sandcastles. But slowly, subtly, that distance began to fade. They started asking him questions: what his favorite color was, if he liked dinosaurs, if he could come to see them play soccer one day. Each question felt like a thread weaving him into their world. Hannah watched it all quietly, never interfering, though her expression often betrayed how conflicted she felt. There were moments when she smiled faintly watching them together, and others when she looked away quickly, as if trying to protect herself from the sight. One afternoon, after the boys had run ahead to chase a ball, Jonathan turned to her and said softly, "You don't have to let me do this." She frowned slightly, unsure what he meant. "Be with them," he clarified. "After what I did to you, I wouldn't blame you if you told me to disappear again." She was silent for a long time before answering. "You're good with them," she said finally. "And they like you. I won't take that away from them. But don't mistake that for forgiveness." Her words stung, but they were honest, and Jonathan respected her all the more for that. He didn't want forgiveness handed to him like a gift. He wanted to earn it, day by day, moment by moment. Weeks turned into months, and gradually, the rhythm of their lives began to change. Jonathan learned how to be patient, how to listen, how to let go of control. The boys began to trust him fully. They called him John at first, then Johnny, and one day, without realizing it, one of them slipped and said, "Dad." The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. Jonathan froze, the air catching in his throat, and Hannah, who had been standing nearby, turned sharply. The boy didn't notice what he'd said and kept talking, but Jonathan's hands trembled. Later, when they were alone, he whispered to Hannah, "I didn't ask him to call me that." She looked at him for a long moment before replying quietly, "I know." There was a storm brewing one evening when Jonathan stopped by their house for the first time. It wasn't planned. He had been driving home from work when he saw Hannah struggling to carry groceries in the rain while keeping the boys close to her side. Without thinking, he pulled over and ran to help. The rain soaked through his shirt instantly, but he didn't care. He took half the bags from her arms and followed her inside. The house was warm and small but filled with life, children's drawings taped to the fridge, toys scattered across the floor, the faint smell of cookies in the air. For a moment, Jonathan just stood there, taking it all in. It was nothing like the cold perfection of his penthouse. It felt like something real, something he had been missing all along. After the storm passed, they sat in the living room, the boys asleep on the couch, small blankets tucked around them. Hannah made him tea, and for a while, they just listened to the rain tapping against the windows. "You've changed," she said suddenly, her voice quiet but sincere. He looked at her, surprised. "Maybe," he said after a moment. "Or maybe I finally stopped pretending I didn't care." She studied his face carefully, as if searching for the man she used to know beneath the one sitting in front of her. "I don't know if I can ever forget what happened," she admitted, "but I can see you're trying." He nodded, emotion thick in his throat. "I'll keep trying," he said. "For them. And for you, if you'll let me." Over time, something fragile and new began to bloom between them. They started sharing small moments again, coffee in the mornings, dinners where laughter returned slowly, hesitantly, like a guest unsure it was welcome. The boys grew more attached to him, and soon, he became a part of their routines. He picked them up from school sometimes, helped with their homework, learned their favorite bedtime stories. Each little moment chipped away at the walls he and Hannah had built between them. One night, after putting the twins to bed, he found Hannah standing by the window, looking out into the quiet street. "They adore you," she said softly. "You know that, right?" He nodded, his voice low. "They saved me." She turned to look at him, and something unspoken passed between them, something warm and real, something that had been lost years ago but wasn't entirely gone. When winter came again, Jonathan realized a full year had passed since he first saw them at the restaurant. His life had changed completely. He no longer spent every waking hour buried in work. His office walls were covered with drawings the twins had made for him, and his phone background wasn't a company logo anymore. It was a photo of the four of them, taken at the park on a sunny day. One evening, as snow began to fall outside, he took Hannah and the boys to see the city lights. The boys ran ahead, laughing, while Hannah and Jonathan walked behind, their shoulders brushing occasionally. "You know," he said quietly, "if someone told me 5 years ago this is where I'd end up, I would have laughed in their face." She smiled faintly. "And now?" He looked at her, his voice steady. "Now I can't imagine being anywhere else." That night, when they got home, the boys fell asleep instantly, exhausted from the excitement. Hannah stood at the door, hesitating for a moment before turning to him. "Jonathan," she said softly, "I think, maybe it's time we stop holding on to the past." He stepped closer, his heart pounding. "Are you saying?" She smiled, just barely. "I'm saying you don't have to keep proving yourself. You already have." He didn't speak, he just reached for her hand, and for the first time in years, she didn't pull away. The silence between them wasn't heavy anymore, it was peaceful. Years later, Jonathan would often think back to that first day in the park, to the fear, the uncertainty, the fragile hope that started everything. He would look at his family, the boys now taller, Hannah's hand still fitting perfectly in his, and he would feel a kind of gratitude that words could never capture. He had spent years building empires, chasing power, believing success was the only thing that mattered. But in the end, it was love, the love he almost destroyed, that rebuilt him completely. And every time he heard his sons call him Dad, he knew he had finally become the man he was always meant to be.